So now that you've deployed your virtual machines, let's look at some of the common management tasks that you might want to do. So here's some examples of some of the common things. Number one, moving a virtual machine, whether it's to another subscription or to another resource group. Resizing a virtual machine to get better performance, faster performance, or maybe to reduce performance to reduce cost. Downloading a VM as a template so you can redeploy it at a later time, or use that template for the basis of creating new virtual machines, then also remotely managing that virtual machine. So to begin, moving a virtual machine is a very simple process. You can do this in the UI or in PowerShell. With PowerShell, there's simply a move Azure RM resource commandlet. You're going to specify the resource you want to move, the new destination. It's an incredibly simple process. When you choose to move a resource, it will also prompt you to move all the related resources. So if you do this via the UI, you can see here by the screenshot, it identifies all the stuff that's got to go with it. If you do this via PowerShell, be aware that you have to identify all these dependencies, and then your PowerShell script, while the commandlet itself is fairly straightforward, might become long and elaborate because you've got to move a lot of different things. Resizing a VM may require a restart for the virtual machine, depending on what it is you're actually changing. For example, Azure supports things like dynamically changing the amount of memory in a VM without needing to shut it down. In some cases, you may need to restart the VM to actually implement that change. Now, if you look at the example of the PowerShell that's there, here's kind of how you make that determination. If you run this get Azure RM VM size commandlet, it's going to tell you all the Azure sizes that are supported on your current physical location where that Azure VM is deployed. If the size is not supported, then you're going to need to deallocate, which is restart and possibly change the IP of the VM to make the size change. You simply specify the new size, update the VM, and Azure will take care of the rest. The only thing you've got to be aware of as the administrator is whether or not this is going to cause a restart, which is obviously a service interruption. Now, if this is a critical web server, that matters. If this is just the VM you're using to administer things, probably doesn't matter all that much. But you can determine whether or not the restart's required by determining if the size that you want to go to is actually available where that VM currently physically resides in Azure. You may want to enable remote management. For RDP, it's port 3389. For PowerShell WinRM, it's port, and I actually forget. So either way, you can do this. I'm just going to go over to my Azure portal real quick. Go to my virtual machine. Go to my networking. And so if I want to enable WinRM, assuming WinRM and PowerShell is enabled within the VM itself, all I've got to do is add the required port rule for WinRM. And port 5986 is the port I was looking for. Click OK. It'll add that rule, and now WinRM is allowed into that virtual machine so I can perform remote management. I've still got to set up WinRM inside the VM. I've still got to specify credentials when I go to connect to it, and you'll see that when we do the demos on this. But this is all you've got to do to enable WinRM. RDP is typically enabled by default, which is right here. And then for Linux, Secure Shell or SSH is enabled by default. So for RDP, you can connect to either the public IP or the public DNS name. If you have a virtual machine and you have not added a public DNS name, you simply go to the public IP address of the virtual machine. You'll notice there's no DNS name here. Go to its configuration, give it a DNS name. It'll tell me whether or not that is an available name. Click Save. It'll update the VM, and now I can RDP to that DNS name. I'm protected from IP address changes, and I can just do that, or I can do the IP address. It really doesn't matter. Same result. Now, in most cases, you will get a certificate error because the RDP certificate is a self-signed certificate, but generally that's something you could ignore. Connecting to WinRM with Server Manager. So within the virtual machine itself, so here's the process for doing this. So we enabled the port, which is step 3 in this process. But there's a few other things you've got to do. Within the virtual machine, you've got to configure it to listen to HTTPS for WinRM. So there's a WinRM configuration command you'll run. You'll see this in the demos. Open the VM firewall port. So just because I've opened the network security group into Azure doesn't necessarily mean that within the virtual machine's operating system, the required port is actually open. So I've got to make sure that port gets open as well. Enable the network security group rule, we just did. Get the public IP, and then run a command like this in PowerShell. Enter PS/computer name. I'm using the IP. I could use the DNS name. Credential, I'm simply asking this command, hey, prompt me for the credential. That's why you see the get credential. Use SSL, and then I'm specifying two session options, which are skip CA check and skip CN check. And what both of those do is basically say, I'm going to go over SSL. The VM itself is using a self-signed certificate, therefore my machine doesn't trust it. Ignore the trust and ignore the name and allow it to go through. So it's SSL, but you're not validating the certificate. If this were a VM that you want to ensure you trust, you would simply want to, when you configure, you do number one, configure WinRM to listen to HTTPS, that you use a certificate or you specify a certificate that your machine already trusts, and then you won't need those additional session options. You'll be able to directly connect, and it'll actually use the certificate trust to verify that you're going to the right machine. For SSH, for Linux VMs, enabled by default, any SSH client works. When you can either do password or certificate authentication, you configure this at the time you deploy the Linux virtual machine. And then finally, any VM or really any object in Azure that you have deployed, you can extract, and we talked about this in one of the earlier courses, the ARM template information. And so, for example, the VM that I've got up there right now, I'm going to close this guy down, and everything has this automation script option. So I'm looking at an individual virtual machine, but I can go to, a database or a resource group, and it'll show me the template. So this is the native Azure ARM template. It'll show me how I do this using the Azure CLI, how I do this in Azure PowerShell. Here's a PowerShell script to recreate my virtual machine. Here it is in .NET, written in C#, and here it is written in Ruby. So you can take any one of these languages. You got the full automation script. What's useful is to download the template. Now, when you download the template, you just have to be aware that of what you're using this template for. Typically this is done and you use it for one of two things. Number one, you want to use this to basically redeploy the exact same VM that you had. So if you want to redeploy the same VM, you can literally reuse the template. The assumption there is before you redeploy the VM, you delete what's already in Azure. So I download the template for VM1, delete VM1, reapply the template for VM1, it recreates it exactly as it was. If you want to use the template as the basis for additional VMs like VM2, 3, 4, and 5, you have to be aware that you're going to need to modify it. So for example, if the VM is based on a storage account, within the template that you download, it will reference the exact storage account. So if you try to deploy the template a second time, you're going to get a conflict because the storage account already exists. So you do have to, I use the term sanitize the template a little bit. And that involves just reading through it, identifying places where it's hard-coded for particular names, and replacing those with variables. For example, one of the most common ones, if you look at this slide here, is for a storage account, use a function within the Azure ARM template language called unique string, and then it takes the subscription ID and it just generates a random value from it, and that becomes the name of the storage account. So you can insert this. If I deploy this template 15 times, every time I deploy it, it'll generate a unique name for the storage account. So things like this would have to get done if you download the template and want to then redeploy that template back into Azure. And again, it gets a little advanced. You need to understand how ARM templates work. We've got a little tutorial on that as part of the overall course, so definitely take a look at it. So that's our look at managing virtual machines and what you might do with a virtual machine once it's been deployed.